This is a map of Africa. If you look at the far northeastern corner, you will find Egypt, home to one of the oldest human civilizations. This transcontinental country boasts a history longer than any other country in the world. The heritage of Misr along the Nile Delta can be traced as far back as the 4th millennium BCE. Ancient Egypt is rightfully being called the cradle of civilization, as both science and archaeology have proven it was the origin of the earliest human development. Whether it's art, literature, language, agriculture, urbanization, or engineering, Egyptians seem to be the pioneers of advancement and technological prowess. You may think the Giza pyramids, mummified pharaohs, and their concealed tombs are all there is to Egypt, but that's not even remotely true. Did you know Egypt has blessed humanity with technology we even use today? They were far too ahead of their time. Some of their inventions are so complex that modern scientists aren't able to figure out how the ancient Egyptians acquired the knowledge to create them. Not only that, they were equally focused on human development. Guess who invented toothpaste and toothbrushes? Egyptians. And who isn't aware that they gave us papyrus, which eventually became the basis of creating paper? Some ancient Egyptian technology is so ahead of its time that the scientists are actually scared of it. And in this video, we'll talk about a few of these terrifying scientific secrets unearthed amongst the ancient remains of Egypt. It's no secret that the Egyptian civilization built magnificent monuments over thousands of years, and this means they definitely had a good grasp of applied mathematics and engineering. Built between 2700 and 2200 BC, the Giza pyramids stand as proof that the Egyptians knew their way around construction. Also, they are able to ensure the longevity of these massive structures. Proficiency and finesse portrayed by the smaller household items were reflected in the megastructures of ancient Egypt too. The attention to detail in Egyptian architecture is uncanny. Experts on Egyptian culture also predict that their construction style often depicted the conservative nature of the Egyptian community. They were methodical and precise. For instance, when building an obelisk, they followed one particular pattern no matter when or where it was being built. Their management of human resources was also truly pristine. The skilled labor was abundant, and the pharaohs were willing to devote exuberant amounts of time and resources to the construction of these structures. The labor would work under the control of a head engineer and his subordinates. These engineers drew plans on papyrus, and using their advanced knowledge of geometry and measurement, were able to build the pyramids with such accuracy that they confuse scientists even today. Geometry was a necessary side product of the surveying process aimed at the preservation of layout and the ownership of land. Hellenistic Egypt has been deemed the origin of lighthouse technology. Alexandria used to be a prime port city for trade ships, and at this port was a cantilevered hoist that was used to lift the cargo from ships. The lighthouse of Alexandria was designed by Sostratus of Cnidus and was built in the 3rd century BC. The ancient Egyptians had also found a way to work solid granite, as depicted by the recent discovery of monumental stone buildings like the one in Saqqara. It's mind-blowing how these people were able to carve and cut granite when, according to archaeologists and historians, the only construction tools they had were made of bronze. Another engineering mystery is the obelisk, found placed at various monument entrances and high-profile buildings of their time, including temples. 29 of these ancient obelisks have survived to date, and there's also the unfinished obelisk that supposedly broke during construction and was abandoned. Egyptologists have theorized that the shapes of the pyramids, as well as the obelisk, were inspired by natural phenomena related to the sun. This means, in one way or the other, the knowledge of astronomy also governed the construction methods of ancient Egyptians. Ramps were widely used in ancient Egypt, especially for construction purposes, as they helped move large and heavy objects like the blocks used to build the pyramids. Experts have explained that the elevation of the Great Pyramid encodes their most important mathematical constants: pi, sigma, and Euler. Interestingly, the Euler number was discovered in 1619, or was it just a rediscovery that our fellow Egyptians were already aware of and using it thousands of years ago? Writer and philosopher John Mitchell also discovered that the elevation geometry used in the Great Pyramid encodes the proportions of the moon and earth. No wonder the immense knowledge and engineering accuracy of ancient Egyptians makes modern scientists nervous. It truly seems like they were much more learned and advanced than we give them credit for. Modern scientists have concluded that ancient Egyptians were irrigation experts. Using their ancient Egyptian calendar, they constructed canals and irrigation ditches. These were supposed to harness the annual floodwater from the Nile River and relay it to the agricultural fields. During the peak of the flooding, the Nile would rise as high as 45 feet above normal. Once this water receded, the rich and fertile soil was exposed, allowing the locals to grow and harvest crops. Their method of water management is called basin irrigation and is based on the principle of the natural rise and fall of the River Nile. They built a network of earthen banks parallel as well as perpendicular to the river, leading to the formation of basins. The floodwater was directed to these basins and allowed to sit for a month, after which it was drained off to a basin downstream, and the farmers would plant crops in the rich soil it left behind. Using this method, the Egyptians controlled the rise and fall of the Nile to suit their agricultural needs. Besides the basins, the Egyptians also built canals to irrigate distant fields. These canals had gates to control the water flow and to form reservoirs in case of a drought. If you think the irrigation canals and basins were futuristic, wait till we introduce you to water wheels and nilometers. These two ancient Egyptian inventions are too advanced for a civilization that created and used them before Christ. The water wheels worked a counterweight system called shadoof. It used a long pole with a bucket attached at one end and a weight at the other. These buckets would be filled with water by dropping them into the Nile. Afterwards, they were raised with the help of water wheels. Oxen were used to swing the pole to empty buckets in the narrow canals or waterways that led to the fields. This was an ingenious system that worked efficiently to irrigate the crops. The other invention, nilometer, was used to predict the flood levels. This instrument marked the height of the Nile. Multiple nilometers were placed along the river and served as an early warning system to warn people that the river was not rising as high as it previously did. This in turn indicated that a drought was to be expected. Nilometers prepared the people for droughts as well as high floods and were vital to the ancient people as they greatly depended on the water levels of the River Nile. The expertise of ancient Egyptians in the field of agriculture and irrigation is a dilemma for scientists in the 21st century. They are still unable to justify this advanced approach of people that inhabited the banks of the Nile about 5,000 years ago. There's been a few instances when archaeologists unearthed impressive yet confusing granite cylinders. What exactly were these cylinders used for, and how was it possible to carve these out from granite without help from modern tools the people of ancient Egypt were not supposed to have back then? History indicated that even the earliest humans were intent on carving holes, especially in teeth, bones, and shells. These holes were drilled using flint tips that were spun around. Flint is extremely hard and can drill into the hardest of stones. A strange 4,500-year-old piece of rock called the Core 7 is a remnant of ancient Egyptian civilization and was discovered near the pyramids by the British archaeologist Flinders Petrie. The cylinder is engraved with concentric lines. Many believe it to be a single concentric line spiraling around the cylinder. So why are modern scientists perplexed by a piece of rock? Well, because it looks exactly like a core that is usually obtained as a byproduct when a hole is drilled. This rock seems to be the core from the hole of a door pivot. But that means ancient Egyptians were able to drill holes into solid granite. According to archaeological evidence, the strongest tools possessed by ancient Egyptians were made of copper, which is relatively a soft metal. It is therefore difficult to accept that they use copper tools to drill holes into granite. Even today, the only material strong enough to penetrate granite is diamond. And if the ancient Egyptians were using diamonds to cut into the stone, then we might just need to rewrite history. The mysterious grooves in Petrie's core are way too advanced. As far as our knowledge goes, ancient Egyptians only had bow drills that they moved back and forth to drill a hole in any surface. The reconstructions of the said bow drill exhibit that carves a distinct back and forth line while drilling, whereas the continuously spiraling line can only be created by a modern power drill. But the Core 7 seems to have been drilled out from such a high-powered, rapidly rotating drill, and this fact is keeping scientists up at night. Did the ancient Egyptians possess a diamond-tipped power drill? It is the only drill that creates a core pattern almost exactly like the one on Core 7. How did the ancient Egyptians manage to drill like this modern drill, turning at 1,600 revolutions per minute? As it turns out, scientists are still unable to provide a reliable explanation. It's impossible, but somehow they did it and left us the proof in the form of this core. And that's not all. After closely studying the core and measuring the space between the grooves, experts have concluded that the drill that carved out this core was more powerful than a modern electric power drill. To put this into perspective, you need to understand that even today, we don't know of any tools having this kind of strength. Does this mean ancient Egyptians were far more advanced than us? They might have possessed tools much better than ours, and we have no historical record of that. The Giza metropolis is one of the most fascinating structures in the world. It's steeped in history, mythology, and mystery. But this time, it's not the archaeologists who are left scratching their heads in confusion, it's the physicists. You heard it right, a team from ITMO University, located in St. Petersburg, Russia, and the Laserzentrum in Hanover, Germany, have discovered that the Great Pyramid is capable of concentrating electromagnetic energy in its base and the internal chambers. The team experimented by applying theoretical physics methods to find out how the pyramid would respond to electromagnetic radiation. These radiations included radio waves, microwaves, gamma rays, X-rays, and ultraviolet light. They wanted to investigate the light scattering of nanoparticles to study closely the electromagnetic properties of the pyramid. This groundbreaking study has paved way for many discoveries. According to the results published in the Journal of Applied Physics, this breakthrough can help scientists in creating new nanoparticles that could be used for many purposes. For instance, in the development of highly efficient solar cells or miniature sensors. The teams were hoping to gain information that could aid them in designing nanoparticles with desired optical properties. The researchers tested their theories by creating a model of the pyramid and its electromagnetic response. They calculated the extinction cross-section and were able to estimate how the wave energy was scattered or absorbed by the pyramid. They used a special analysis called multipole analysis and found that the internal chambers and base of the pyramid were where the scattered fields were concentrated. This might just point to the fact that ancient Egyptians knew more about physics than we thought they did. The fact that they managed to build massive pyramids is still hard to digest for modern scientists, so the thought that they might have been organizing them to focus electromagnetic energy is mind-boggling to say the very least. It is, however, highly unlikely that they were aware of these unique properties of the pyramid, but it still seemed like an interesting coincidence that a monument supposed to be an extravagant tomb can manipulate electromagnetic energy. Medicine and surgery in ancient Egypt. Being the oldest human civilization, it's only fair to assume the Egyptians were 2 steps ahead of the rest of the world in the field of medicine. Ancient papyri have been discovered over time which provide us a glimpse of medical procedures and practices dating back at least 5,000 years. These papyri provide information about prevalent diseases, diagnosis, and remedies. Early Egyptian medicine was mainly a mixture of spells and religious magic, but the doctors often performed medical or surgical procedures. The first ever papyri discovered is called the Berlin Papyrus. It was published and discovered by Heinrich Brugsch in 1863. Another papyrus called the Ebers Papyrus, broadly explaining the basic concepts of general pathology, was published in 1875. And about 20 years after that, F.L. Griffith published the Kahun Papyrus, providing details about the practice of gynecology. Subsequently, many other papyri were published. The Kahun Papyrus dates back to 1800 BCE and is regarded as the oldest medical text discovered in Egypt. It covers multiple gynecological subjects, including diseases, women's health, pregnancy, fertility, and contraception. It also provides an elaborate guideline on the interaction between patient and physician. The Ramesseum Papyri mainly focuses on the eye, the musculoskeletal system, pediatrics, and gynecology. The Edwin Smith Papyrus describes trauma cases, their diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis. This particular papyrus points out that the ancient Egyptians were well aware of human organs like the liver, spleen, kidneys, ureter, and bladder. They also knew that all blood vessels eventually connect to the heart. The Ebers Papyrus surprisingly mentions migraines. This means that this problem dates back to earlier Egyptian times. Until the Persian invasion of 525 BC, the Egyptian medical practices remained more or less the same. They performed simple, non-invasive surgical procedures, setting of bones, and more. They had an extensive set of pharmacopoeia. Like most other civilizations, the Egyptians also discovered the medicinal properties of many local and foreign plants. The papyri offered various recipes for many ailments. The Ebers Papyrus alone provides 800 remedies, including topical ointment, wrappings, and oral medication. The oldest metallic surgical tools in history have been discovered in the tomb of Ka. These were made of bronze. Surgery was a pretty common practice for the treatment of physical injuries. They had a system of triage. They would classify injuries in one of 3 categories: treatable, contestable, and untreatable. The surgeons used to prioritize fixing the treatable issues, whereas the patients falling in the contestable category were considered well enough to survive without treatment, so they were only kept under observation. The tools they used included saws, spoons, pincers, knives, drills, forceps, and more. Circumcision was pretty standard practice during their time. Prosthetics like artificial toes, eyeballs, and tongues were also used, mainly for decorative purposes though. The surgical knowledge, mummification, and religious autopsy practices provided the ancient Egyptians with adequate information about human morphology. They even correctly guessed the function of some organs. For instance, they knew blood was a transportation medium that carries oxygen and removes carbon dioxide. Egyptian physicians were also aware of the presence of a pulse and how it was related to the heart. The author of the Smith Papyrus seemed to know a little about the cardiac system. The ancient Egyptians theorized about channels carrying air, blood, and water around the body by using the river Nile as inspiration. Based on this, they developed a way to treat an unwell person by giving him or her laxative that would unblock these channels. The Ebers Papyrus is the oldest text that mentions enema, indicating that many medications were administered using enemas. The good few of their medical practices were pretty effective, especially in the field of surgery, as described in the Edwin Papyrus. The ancient Egyptian physicians were also aware of how important hygiene was for health. That's why they advised the patients to wash and shave their bodies regularly in order to avoid infections. They also emphasized that a healthy diet was crucial to avoid disease and discouraged people from consuming meats considered unclean. While the ancient Egyptians weren't always correct, archaeological evidence shows they had ample medical knowledge to confuse modern scientists and physicians as to how they were able to figure out this much before any other civilization. Shipbuilding and navigation. Trade was vital to the Egyptian economy and their culture as well. That's why ships were immensely important to the ancient Egyptians. They employed their knowledge of aerodynamics while building their ships. They developed the use of many adjustable sails that would help the ship sail. Though the earlier sails were supposed to just catch the wind and push the ship, later on they got better at it and were able to build ships with sails that could push against the wind. It's reported that Queen Hatshepsut herself oversaw the funding and construction of an expedition of 5 ships. Another boat Queen Hatshepsut used for transporting obelisks was about 200 feet long. These ships were 70 feet long and had several sails. The ancient Egyptians didn't just build state-of-the-art ships. Their ships were sturdy and some even managed to survive to this day. The Khufu ship is one example. It is a full-size solar baroque found sealed into a pit at the foot of the Great Pyramid. It's one of the oldest and best-preserved ships found intact, and experts believe it would sail if they put it in the water even today. The Egyptians were also the first to use stern-mounted rudders. By 16th century BC, Egyptians had constructed heavily armed ships, from small papyrus rafts carrying one person to massive vessels able to transport heavy cargo. The Egyptians had it all. Though it wasn't until 2400 BC that the ancient Egyptians were able to build vessels that could withstand the waves of the Mediterranean. These vessels didn't have a keel, but rope trusses resembling a suspension bridge kept them from tipping over. They were propelled by oars and a tall sail. Records dating back to the period when the pyramids were built report ships traveling to Lebanon in order to bring cedar and other valuable woods. Around 1500 BC, the Egyptians figured out how to build keels and internally reinforced hulls. 2 new kinds of ships became known around this time. The first kind of sailing ships had wide hulls and smaller crews that were ideal for transporting cargo. The second type were developed particularly for warfare. They had narrow, par-driven galleys. According to experts, boats had been associated with warfare since the prehistoric period. So now the question is, how did the ancient Egyptians know where to go using these ships? Well, the Egyptians used sun clocks. They also used constellations to find out their location. No wonder they were traveling across waters and bringing home goods from far-flung places. Ancient Egyptians seem to have a good command of the art of building ships, and modern science is unable to explain how they excelled at it thousands of years ago. The Dendra Light. This mind-boggling ancient Egyptian discovery has scientists terrified of their bones. There's a possibility that the Egyptians had, or were at least aware, of electricity. This could mean history might be absolutely wrong about them. Under the Temple of Hathor at Dendra are crypts that were initially considered storerooms. Some of these were decorated. In the easternmost chambers are inscriptions depicting an object bearing an uncanny resemblance to a light bulb. A few experts have suggested it might be a remnant of the crux tube, an old model of a light bulb. Inside the bulbs is an undulating line formed by a snake originating from what looks like a lotus flower and is considered the socket of this bulb. A wire is seen leading to a box on which the air god is kneeling. There's a two-armed jed pillar connecting to the snake. According to Eric von Daniken, the snake represents the filament, the pillar was the insulator, and the baboon standing beside it bearing two knives was probably a warning sign. The temple where these inscriptions were found is constructed of sandstone, but for the carvings, a limestone block had been installed. This indicated that the inscriptions had a ritual, religious, or maybe educational significance. While the mainstream theory proposes that this motif depicts the Egyptian myth of creation, some are still not willing to give up on the possibility that the ancient Egyptians might have figured out how to produce electricity. Some believe that the ancient Egyptians weren't using light bulbs like we normally do. Instead, they think that the priests used to perform a particular ritual during New Year festivities that resulted in the production of a small amount of light. According to proponents, the inscriptions explain a three-step procedure involving the support provided to the bulb by the kneeling god, the jed. The waves are considered proof of a vibratory process, progressively increasing in frequency. Fringe theorists use a humorous suggestion by J.N. Lockyer to justify the bulb theory. He opined that electric lamps might explain why there are no lamp black deposits in the tombs. A text referring to high pikes covered with copper plates may also relate to electricity production. Most of these theories have been debunked by professionals because it doesn't seem plausible that the Egyptians left behind no other trace of electric devices or even actual bulbs. But there's still a chance that the ancient Egyptian priest had encoded a deeper scientific meaning in the discovered images and text. Astronomy. Egyptians have no doubt made an enormous contribution to the development of humankind. Their achievements in astronomy were some of the most accurate and are even applied today. Though at the time it wasn't considered a separate science, and like most ancient cultures, the Egyptian knowledge of astronomy was deeply rooted in religion and mythology. The 7,000 years old stone circles located in Upper Egypt stand proof that this science was vital to their religious life. Initially, it was used to establish the dates of religious festivals. The oldest known astronomical texts discuss the movements and phases of stars and planets. They also developed a unique system of constellations to guide them. In the first intermediate period, ancient Egyptians used to paint diagonal star tables on the inside of coffin lids and the ceiling of tombs and temples. During the Greco-Roman Egypt period emerged one of the most accomplished astronomers of his time, Claudius Ptolemy. He went on to write many influential texts, including the Almagest that catalogued around 1,022 stars. It also described how to predict the behavior of planets. Ancient Egyptians first developed an interest in astronomy after noticing that the annual flooding of the Nile coincided with the first visible appearance of stars at dawn. This observation paved way for the development of their 365-day calendar, which was truly a revolutionary breakthrough for that time. Their knowledge of astronomy guided the orientation of sacred buildings that were built facing true north. The ancient Egyptians also used the heliacal rising of Sirius to fix the New Year's Day and to determine the seasons. The Egyptians believed that their gods lived in the kingdom of Osiris, which was located in the part of the sky where the Orion constellation rose. The three pyramids of Giza represent the three stars in the belt of Orion, whereas the Sphinx represents the Leo constellation. They considered the Nile a representative of the Milky Way. They aimed at creating a landscape that reflected the night sky. Today, modern astronomers have revealed that the celestial North Pole was located exactly between Kochab and Mizar in 2467 BCE. And to make sure that a pharaoh joins the circumpolar stars in the northern sky, the pyramid was designed in a way that it faced Kochab and Mizar. That is too accurate to be a coincidence. Using their vast knowledge of astronomical science, the ancient Egyptians may have discovered the variable stars. These stars fade and brighten at regular intervals. They also managed to precisely calculate the period of the infamous variable star called Algol, long before the Europeans did. Surprisingly, the Egyptians weren't just practicing astronomy theoretically. They had developed tools like the sundial, clepsydra, Merket, and more that allowed them to measure the stellar azimuths. Their expertise in astronomy also made them the first civilization in the ancient world that divided the day into hours. It took them some time to establish the length of these hours, but soon enough they managed to divide the day into 24 hours of fixed length. It's also a possibility that the Egyptians had developed the idea of a spherical Earth long before Alexander the Great arrived in Egypt. It was the knowledge acquired in Egypt that was later adopted by Pythagoras to propose that the Earth might be spherical. During the 5th dynasty, 6 Egyptian kings built temples dedicated to Ra, the sun god. The ones built by Nioseri at Abu Ghurab and Usafak at Abu Sir have been excavated. These temples have astronomical alignments, and it's believed that the roofs of some of these temples were used to view the stars, calculate the hours at night, and predict the time for sunrise. There are some disputed claims that the Egyptians may have been aware of the precession of equinoxes even before the time of Hipparchus. Now, the Egyptian observation of the stellar alignment over many years wasn't downright accurate, and due to this, they went in error after a few centuries. But for their time, the Egyptians were far more advanced in the field of astronomy than any other ancient civilization. Their progressive approach and vast knowledge is hard to justify. Modern science is still in awe of how much they achieved and managed to decode in a primitive era. How did the ancient Egyptians build a society that was incredibly progressive and ahead of time? Is modern history and science gravely underestimating this civilization? The ancient technology discovered in Egypt hints that they had tools and devices that mysteriously resemble the ones we use in the 21st century. Are we just being paranoid? Do we have enough reason to fear the great ancient Egyptian civilization? Tell us what you think in the comments below.